Before the golden age detective story could be preserved, before it could be perfected, before it could even begin to fade, television had to inherit something more fundamental. It had to inherit the idea that crime could be understood at all, that a confusing series of events could be made coherent, that what appears disconnected is not beyond explanation, that a single mind working alone could take fragments and turn them into something clear. That idea does not begin with television, and it does not begin with the Golden Age. It begins with one figure, Sherlock Holmes. When Sherlock Holmes first appears in the late 19th century, detective fiction does not yet exist in a stable form. There are mysteries, there are crimes, there are investigators, but these elements do not yet combine into something that can reliably carry a story. The act of solving a crime is still one element among many, not yet the central mechanism. Holmes changes that. Not by introducing a formal structure, not by defining a set of rules, but by demonstrating something more basic. That confusion can be made intelligible. That what appears chaotic is not beyond understanding. That events are not random, but connected. This is the crucial shift. The detective is no longer simply a participant in the story. He becomes a figure through whom the story acquires meaning. What defines Holmes is not a system in the latest sense. It is not a process that can be learned, applied, and repeated by others. It is something less stable and more immediate. It is intelligence applied in real time. Holmes observes details others overlook. He notices the small, the incidental, the apparently insignificant. From these fragments, he constructs an explanation. He moves from observation to conclusion with a speed that can feel almost disorienting. At times, the process is explained, the steps are shown, the reasoning becomes visible. But just as often, the explanation arrives fully formed, as if the intermediate stages have taken place out of sight. And this means that detection has not yet become a shared activity. The audience is not fully invited into the process. There is no consistent sense that the mystery could be solved by anyone else using the same information. Instead, what is presented is something closer to demonstration, a display of intelligence, a proof that understanding is possible, even if the path to that understanding is not always accessible. The detective story at this stage is not a game between story and audience. It is still centered on the figure of the detective. Holmes is not simply someone who solves crimes. He is someone whose presence reshapes the narrative. When he enters a case, confusion begins to organize itself. Details that seemed meaningless begin to align. What was previously obscure becomes legible. But that transformation does not come from an external structure. It comes from him. There is no system operating independently of the character, no visible framework that could exist without him. The story does not function without Holmes. He is not operating within a system. He is the system. And that makes him fundamentally different from many of the detectives who would follow. When detective fiction moves into television, it does not begin from nothing. It inherits this model. A central figure, a mind that imposes order, a character capable of carrying the structure of the story. This turns out to be essential because television places specific demands on storytelling. Stories must work repeatedly. They must be understood quickly. They must sustain attention across multiple episodes. And crucially, what is happening must be visible. A detective story on the page can conceal its workings. It can rely on narration, on internal thought, on perspective that withholds information. Television cannot do this in the same way. It must show what is happening. It must make the process of understanding visible. And in doing so, it exposes something important. What works as impressions on the page becomes structure on screen. Holmes's brilliance can be shown, but it cannot always be shared. The audience sees the result, but does not always see a method that can be followed. What feels convincing in prose becomes, on screen, a visible gap. And that gap will affect the form as it develops. But at this stage, it is enough. because Holmes provides what television needs: continuity through character, a figure strong enough to carry the narrative, even when the structure is not yet fully stabilised. The golden age of detective fiction will later introduce a different kind of structure. Stories will become more carefully balanced. Clues will be distributed in ways the audience can follow. The mystery will become something that can, in principle, be solved. Detection will become a shared process. But Holmes exists before that stabilisation. His cases do not operate as carefully constructed puzzles. They operate as demonstrations. Proof that beneath the surface of events there is an underlying logic, even if that logic is not yet fully shared. He does not establish a system, he makes the idea of a system believable. That distinction is essential because it marks the difference between the origin of the detective story and its later development as a form. One of the most striking things about Sherlock Holmes is how easily he survives adaptation. Different actors, different periods, different interpretations, and yet the character remains recognisable. This durability does not come from a fixed structure. It comes from a clear core, a mind that observes, a mind that connects, a mind that insists that nothing is truly random. That core can be expressed in many different ways. It can be formal or eccentric, restrained or intense, modernized or left in its original setting. But it remains intact because it is not dependent on a specific system. It is dependent on a principle. That principle allows Holmes to persist across decades of television, even as the form around him continues to evolve. Once that foundation is in place, the genre begins to change. Writers begin to shape detective stories more deliberately. They balance information. They construct mysteries that invite participation. They develop detectives who operate within clearer boundaries. The individual brilliance of Holmes gives way to something more structured, something more repeatable, something that can be recognized as a form. This is where the golden age begins to take shape, not as a rejection of Holmes, but as an attempt to organize what he made possible, to take the idea of detection and turn it into a system that can be shared. When we look back at Sherlock Holmes from the perspective of later detective fiction, it is tempting to see him as simply the greatest example of the type, the definitive version, the standard against which others are measured. But that misses something important. Holmes is not the refinement of a genre. He is the moment before the genre fully exists. He demonstrates that a detective story can work, that it can hold attention, that it can produce satisfaction through understanding. But he does not yet make that process fully visible or fully repeatable. But everything that follows builds on what Sherlock Holmes provided. Before the Golden Age could define the detective story, before it could preserve it, perfect it, or reinvent it, it needed a figure who made the entire idea convincing. Sherlock Holmes provided that figure by proving that confusion could be resolved, that events could be brought into relation, that understanding was possible. That is why the character has endured, and why even now he still stands at the beginning of the detective story, not as its final form, but as the moment that made it possible.